Today I am asking myself if I will ever live to build anything again. If I will ever find the drive or motivation to sit down and try to create another project. Over 30 years ago, there was no question. I am a person who lives in the past. In the past, there is a golden age that died over 20 years ago now. I've been trying to recapture it for quite some time, but it's long gone, never to return. What I am today, who I am today, is unlike what I was back then, unlike what I was even 6 years ago. Today I shall take you on such a reflective journey, the age before decay. I'm searching for something I lost quite some time ago. The spark of aspiration, the key ingredient to locomotion. For all my life, I could simply activate and do things. I likened it to striking a flintstone. With a flick of a wrist, I could have something in my head I could attempt to create. Not very well, mind you, but I would try. One of the projects I still fondly recall is the aptly titled Project Loli. It was a reboot of my Khan the Destroyer project for Diablo 2. The project was armed with more modern frameworks and some oversight from experienced developers to help combat some of the hard-coded issues with the game, but nonetheless, it was a comparatively short-lived adventure. Project Loli shares with ApexX several key notes. First, I worked on maps and creatures more than items or characters, but my initial foray into items for the project, embattled by the autistic mess of Diablo's loot and stat system, was to reduce numbers across the board. Project Loli featured vast pre-built maps mixed with the conventional randomized maps usually used as transition zones or caves. The variety of creatures and so on that could spawn was of course much larger, and the unique and champion creatures that could spawn were usually higher level for the variety of areas. Lethality was increased dramatically, and the project was very cutthroat where progression was earned through careful and strategic gameplay. All this should sound somewhat familiar. Project Loli was worked on in 2009, and it's bundled in what I call the Living World concept, and is one of the many projects that pursued this ideology. Except for the fact this was a Diablo project, and thus featured items and leveling up. My plans for the item system I still remember. Growth would be slow and very gradual, with each zone representing a substantial hike over the other. It would take a while to reach double-digit numbers. Leveling up even to level 2 would be challenging. Both KTD and Project Loli featured a very high lethality entry barrier, a bit higher than desired since it was a single large map, but nonetheless a feeling of clawing for any individual drop. In other words, I broke the convention of what in present day would be called a loot simulator, in which enormous amounts of waste are sorted through for the odd valuable, and tried to make every drop valuable at least as much as I could, even gold. I didn't have any particular plan in mind for leveling and what stats would do, but given I planned to nuke the difficulty system and then expand the levels while decreasing the number bloat, it's quite evident I had something equally dramatic in mind. However, I would come to idolize Guild Wars, and perhaps in some extent I would replicate that in this game as well. What you might notice is the similarities between ApexX and Project Loli. The dark mood, the use of the weather system, and abstract level designs. Project Loli is set in the Lolden's The Legend universe, but nonetheless featured many dark tones, as that universe often did. ApexX and its designs are not so spurious. They come from projects like this one. But along the way I grew a distaste for item systems and leveling up. Because every game I experienced them in, I found them appalling. I have never played a game where I found the process of leveling up exciting. and itemization was so annoying and so irritating at the best of times, if I had to pay attention to it at all, that is, that I found Guild Wars to be the absolute peak of both designs. Guild Wars had a level cap of 20, which you hit fairly early into any given expansion, along with the item caps. All of your customization came down to your build, what skills you had, and what affixes and stuff you attached to your gear, most of which were relatively available even at the start of the game, so long as you could afford them, that is. The idea that progression is based on skill and approach and strategy is something that always stuck with me from Guild Wars and stood the test of time, especially when Guild Wars 2 destroyed everything the first game stood for. And along the way, when I experienced the Souls products and similar things, I eventually deduced a branch between what was called the authenticity and genuine discovery, and then the pursuit of skill-based progression. And I began to realize, especially when I faced Naraka, that things like Project Loli and ApexX in its current iteration could not work unless exploration had an exterior hook, something related to the progression, something that gave you a reason and incentive to explore that wasn't something arbitrary. In Naraka, it was PvP, but it was also loot. And in games like Diablo and all the derivatives, of course, it was either random maps or it was loot. But what made a good loot system, or at least an acceptable loot system, I never found out. The project was hounded by instability and crashes to the point that I attempted to make a demo of it in 2016 and failed. And today, in 2025, I also failed, for reasons that nobody really knows. The project was likely abandoned in this state years ago. But it wasn't the last time I brushed shoulders with the complexity of item systems and the questions therein. Because when it came to the Warcraft 3 edition of the Lolden's Legends project, I would encounter this exact same challenge. Looking upon old development screenshots from Khan the Destroyer, you see what is effectively the same story retold time and time again. Juvenile as it was, the project still focused on building huge pre-built maps and creatures, rather than trying to do anything in related to the items, the leveling system, or other major core gameplay parts, at least things most other people would consider core gameplay. In the Eternity Mark I and Mark II projects, the early Warcraft 3 total conversions, you will find that I focused on developing the factions and units more so than anything related to the items or the actual heroes themselves. These huge projects even featured races with only heroes in them, but I didn't do that much in relations to items, and I didn't really tweak the actual abilities or leveling up process that much in itself, other than reskinning some things. To me, triggering things was the least interesting thing you could possibly do, but in Warcraft 3 it was necessary. As disgusting as Warcraft 3 was as an RTS design, I didn't shirk away from heroes or item systems. I just didn't do anything with them. I didn't really know how to make them work. I transitioned away from campaigns and started working on a project called Lolden's of Legend. Lolden's of Legend has seen many iterations, and this time it would be an AOS clone, just like Dota. It first started as a reskinned TGS map, but eventually War Giant got involved and something far larger took place. Something that, unlike the Diablo 2 project, is functional to present day. War Giant created custom terrain based on a blueprint for me, and over time created custom assets including textures and doodads. And when everything began to come together, one of my largest and most successful multiplayer projects finally took off. The Lolden's of Legend AOS was built for Ricky's game night exclusively. I don't recall the exact timeline of projects, but it's clear that my porting skills were weaker in this project than the Age of Wonders 2 project. Nonetheless, this one follows a trend of everything else discussed thus far. As one who has no artistic skills whatsoever, I prioritized shoring up the weaknesses of my skill set. I learned how to port World of Warcraft assets thanks to being taught by someone I can't even recall at this point, possibly Warbringer aka Xenix87, although with some critical aspects, proper hit test, sound events, and similar functionality for example, these are absent. This was also one of my first major forays into particle editing, and that was with poorly made user tools that even then some of my effects, including the fire for Horde Brazers, turned out quite well. User-created effects from shitty third-party websites either look bad like many of the spell effects, or are just broken by the refunded update like the Isidorian Fortress projectiles. If I wanted to, I could probably fix these, but why would I? What will strike you right away is War Giant's terrain, and the doodads and other things I added alongside his. There was a substantial amount of technical work. Both factions have a number of functional heroes, with many of them using JAS systems from a variety of people. The only reason this version even functions at all, despite numerous bugs, is because Bill the Emu, a fine young man-bird with a troubled history attending radical leftist rallies, digested a variety of triggers broken by the return bug fiasco. The map features a physics engine used for a handful of abilities, mostly on the evil side, such as Maja's Headbutt launch and Lord Dread's Bloodbolt ability. These also use custom particles I've made in many cases. Also of note is the creep division system. Every so often each faction gets a resource that they, as a team, can spend to upgrade a faction within their creep spawns. These range from support healers to tanks to siege weapons, AoE damage and other specializations. Each division has a max of 10 levels, and some of them synergize to spawn special units at certain thresholds. I wanted the creeps and the NPC combat of the map to be something you consider when building your team, and something that you can interact with, without relegating it to bounty and other snowball resources. Even so, capturing the guard towers in the center of lanes or outside of lanes increases the rate at which this resource is generated. NPC bosses of an admittedly overwhelming power level in most cases will spawn as the game progresses, mostly harassing the central lane but sometimes in the side lanes. The non-functional control centers belonging to either faction at the top and bottom would also affect division upgrades and possibly other benefits. Neutral creep spawns only currently possess the overwhelmingly powerful Rust Dragon that exists for no reason other than to fuck your shit. The good side has a waygate that leads to the evil side hero selection spawn, for no particular reason. What the map does not feature is custom items. The description for many items are changed, but the functionality is default for all except the ludicrously expensive 7,500 gold item that doesn't even tell you what it does. There's hidden shop NPCs scattered throughout the map, but none of them sell anything. The only existing reward for killing the neutral bosses is some gold, which helps get the starter items, and that's about it. Lulladins of Legend also adhered to what became a mantra solidified in Apex within StarCraft 2. Upgrades are dumb. While division upgrades improved minion damage, no armor upgrades were to be found on the NPCs. Even then, the division damage upgrade is a band-aid, because I'm pretty sure many division upgrades are just dead levels. I don't recall precisely what my plan was in this regard, but the map was enslaved to third parties for nearly all trigger work, because JAS was incomprehensible, and the Warcraft 3 trigger system was a minefield of gotchas, hardcode, and bugs. Even today in 2025, with my ludicrously powerful system, this basic map with nothing going on regularly stalls and stutters. Back in the day, some players couldn't load it at all because the terrain took Warcraft 3 so long to generate, just because of the cliffs. I'd encountered it in campaign maps, too. The more cliffs a map had, the longer it took to load. Lulladins of Legend had an external EXE with 100 meg of assets, but virtually nothing was touched in regards to the items. The leveling system was contested as well. Heroes had a stat attribute bonus, but only a few triggered abilities properly scaled off of stats. The former presented scaling challenges in endgame, especially with so few items, and the latter poses a sore spot for all heroes without triggered abilities. To make matters worse, Tiprith, the main person behind my triggers, was notorious for inserting insanely broken heroes and one-shot nonsense, and I didn't reel him in nearly enough, out of fear of losing his support. All of this coalesced into a very specific approach to the project that likely only reinforced the stigmas I was developing over time. I didn't want to think about items on the map for two reasons. First, the heroes and everything were evidently in such a volatile and unreliable state, as it was, that balancing them alongside item scaling would immensely complicate my work. I viewed items and heroes as two separate islands. Incidentally, in games like League of Legends, many heroes are defined by item builds, and this would always feel terrible. I preferred Heroes of the Storm later on, where heroes stood on their own without needing the puddle-deep process of buying predetermined item builds. Items in games like League only serve as a snowball mechanism, and are fundamentally uninteresting because they are solved. Solved systems are always boring and amount to QTEs. I want my heroes to be balanced like Heroes of the Storm did them, without any items at all. Years in advance before Blizzard figured out this could even be done. But I didn't plan to abandon items, despite player pressure to put a system in. The second problem is that I didn't want to use a recipe system. Item recipe systems like those in Dota exist primarily as a means to gatekeep newer players. They are an unnecessary memory test, if not a de facto QTE. They do clean up the shops a bit, but they aren't necessary. I didn't want a recipe system because I couldn't see any way to make it interesting. Making the process of acquiring items interesting was the initial hurdle I never overcame. Items are power spikes acquired from currency, and while you can make the currency system the interesting aspect by tying it to PvP, the actual process of spending money is never rewarding or engaging. You simply make numbers larger, or your opponent does. Items have always been fundamentally intrinsically tied to making a line go up, and that by design isn't fun. I've always imagined items as being something that could offer extra utility, functionality, or customization. But without extensive triggering and a level of design and foresight for the heroes I could never accomplish at the time, I reached a decision paralysis. What exists in the map is merely a band-aid and really just there to stem the player request for items to spend money on in a very short term. Players want there to be items because otherwise bounty, especially from killing heroes and neutral bosses, has no value. There's no incentive to do anything but try to force down key structures to stop enemy creep spawns and get the snowball rolling to end game. The Oldens of Legend has some bad snowballing in it, because creep spawn structures can't be rebuilt, and the bosses that represent your nexus aren't that strong, and can't resist continued attack even from only 2 lanes. That said, because there was no way for heroes to scale past max level, ending the game when you have a huge advantage was still difficult until you cleared all the lanes. Without much ability to interact as a solo player, it took me capping 2 divisions and putting another at level 4 over nearly an hour to end the game. Not because the defenses were overly strong, but because it was too difficult for me to do anything as an individual. I had money, but not enough to buy the 7,500 gold item yet, more than enough to fill my inventory otherwise. I originally envisioned out-of-lane play as being the main way to get resources and items. Contesting neutral NPCs, contesting the open tower garrisons for division resources, trying to gank players transitioning lanes, controlling the 2 points on the north and south regions, so on. These wouldn't have been too difficult to set up, but the rewards for doing so weren't devised, so they never got started on. Most of the map is fairly empty and naked as a result. All of this is merely a reflection of the same sort of void that exists in ApexX, just for different reasons. But it all stems from similar gaps in my overworld design approach. The only project in which I did not spurn custom items was Lowlands of Legend 2042, the Age of Wonders 2 project. I created custom items to make use of item assets, and also to replace all the goofy default items. However, in that game, the player was able to forge their own items in-game, so custom items weren't as necessary, other than high-level pieces that exceeded the stat levels that you could build. Otherwise, I spurned item and leveling up design in virtually every project I created. People engage things they are interested in. If someone is ghosting you on a subject, it's because they have no interest. If you ghost yourself or your production on a subject, it's because you have no interest. It's important to recognize this and try to identify why. In ApexX, I focused on the character asset both because it's the most important part of the project and because it was the most important thing to me, especially the most important thing to get right. Everything is experienced through the lens of the player character, and getting it right not only makes me feel comfortable, it also gives me a groundwork with which to approach everything else, from both as a player and as a developer. I wanted to prove that this idea could work, just to myself, and I wanted something to look at I could be proud of. I worked on things like levels and creatures because they were things that interested me in turn, distinct colors, lighting effects, and experiences therein. I would constantly stop myself when I knew I wasn't progressing the challenging aspects of the project. I didn't want to waste my time, energy, and commitment on something I wasn't confident I would get anywhere meaningful. I didn't want any more regret than I was already going to have. I was correct to do so. The project went nowhere meaningful. But the player character and the lack of artistic ability is only one piece of the puzzle. At the heart of the overworld progression troubles is I don't want to recreate the same products that failed. God of War, Devil May Cry, Dark Souls all failed for similar reasons. Dead worlds, no combat, and spurning what little they did have. Through my review process branch, I concluded I had a silver bullet to defeating all of these. That was having a living world, having combat, and avoiding linear corridors and arenas. The challenge therein is providing an incentive for exploring the world without resorting to grind or QTEs, without forcing you to go, rather having you find you want to go. Since I also abolished any progression mechanisms such as experience and items, I had to conjure a mechanism which not only encouraged the player to look around, but also kept this experience fresh for hundreds of playthroughs or attempts on the same maps. With my experiences and no Raka under my belt, I concluded the only way to do this was through PvP mechanisms, and injecting some nature of volatility into the seeding of the world. In a single-player environment, only so much can be realistically obtained by such random seeding, leading me to theory crafting a randomizer system, the results of which I demonstrated in an earlier production. It appears that some portion of me recognized I needed to either make a compromise or give up a difficult design challenge and accept I was no longer in a mental state to close the gap, especially without concept material to demonstrate and unit test. Since I have no energy to build any given idea, I have no means to validate if they are legitimate or not. In such a case, I wondered if being able to mod and strip down games like, say, Elden Ring or Dragon's Dogma would have been an acceptable middle ground. Before ApexX was launched, I said I wanted to create a Dragon's Dogma clone, but this is inarguably a far more challenging design to create, and a much harsher demand on assets than anything I've discussed thus far, and likely everything combined. After all, it would require me to get into items, and visual representations of items. Evidently, what I have in my hands is a more powerful system than any engine From Software or Capcom possesses, and I have a similar amount of resources in terms of creatures and environments, but not modular characters. Making most of the game's systems at this point is not tremendously difficult, just time-consuming, and time is a most precious resource. This power has its own decision paralysis pitfalls. I don't have any guarantees any hypothetical project would be more interesting to me than another, but because I have this, I've begun to realize I need that pristine mindset to make the most use of it. I don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, and I don't want to waste time and energy on fruitless ventures, so I do nothing at all. And henceforth I don't learn any of the critical lessons I could be learning through such prototypes. The years tick on by. I feel that if there is to be any hope at all in moving forward in any development life, it must start immediately. and I must choose a direction and stick with it until I know it is a failure. ApexX, as it is a failure, but I didn't learn much from that failure. Only that I don't have the answers I need. I'm missing some critical pieces of a puzzle I don't have the full shape of. I have begun to think that perhaps I need to approach this challenge from the opposing angle. Rather than try to devise a zone progression system which is exempt from these features, cut out the entire prospect of zones and progression entirely, and focus on a single island that I've spent most of my life avoiding. I could attempt to propose an answer to two very simple, but very challenging questions. Very new ones. How do I make an item system that is interesting? And how do I make a leveling system that is interesting? And at the heart of these two queries, what makes progression exciting? And how can I keep it fresh across thousands of hours? Let's take a look at items first. In the RPG-styled games I played the most, Diablo and Dungeons & Dragons. Diablo is similar to Demon's Souls in that it has an inventory burden, but the way it's expressed is more readable, more sensible, and more interesting. The inventory Tetris, you might call it, represents item weight and requires you to manage your loot somewhat carefully. In Diablo 2 Classic, nearly any rare item had the possibility to be good, but on Lord of Destruction and onward, Blizzard repeatedly nerfed the randomization of good stats over and over to encourage grinding, then introduced rune words and other nonsense which did nothing but further compound the grinding problem to the point that Diablo, and thus World of Warcraft, which used its designs for loot tables and rarity, became synonymous with botting. Thus, two key things do I take from Diablo. First is the interaction with items themselves. Since they occupy physical space in a physical body, they immediately command more presence than just icons with numbers attached. Greatswords are big and daggers are small. A set of full plate is larger than tomes and scrolls. You can thus have more detailed art for them as well. Compare a Diablo inventory to a World of Warcraft grid inventory. The difference is clear as day. From Software did one thing right in their games: inventory graphics. Well, you don't get to appreciate them in the grid, and it can even be difficult to identify things at a glance. When you want to maximize low-weight builds, you need to constantly switch between items and numbers. This offers some granularity that a Diablo system might not, but such a detail isn't likely to be necessary for my project anyways. The other thing I take from Diablo is that drops at certain level ranges are all valuable because in Diablo 2 Classic you don't need to farm specific super uniques or bosses to access specific drop tables, invalidating the entire game. All of Act 4 Hell, for example, is fair game, so there's reason to explore and kill everything you find rather than just have Pindlebot kill the same zombie all night. Any rare has a good chance of having decent stats, and in Classic you don't need tiny minuscule chances to drop runes. You don't feel punished by clearing a zone and not just running Baal or Ubers over and over. In D&D, every single item on random tables has a chance of being good because there aren't many throwaway items. At least in the games I've played or ran, finding items is always interesting because the process of discovery or construction involves roleplay and generally the results will be valuable or at least interesting. Uncovering items usually has an investment, or both, exploration and challenge, involved. And especially in D&D, the threat can be quite high. Furthermore, weight and space management are also a thing in D&D, though apparently some DMs forget about it. One of the things I hated about Dragon's Dogma was the fixed drop tables. Each and every box or monster could only drop a couple of items and reset over the course of in-game days, so the optimal way to get what you wanted was to Godsbane relentlessly. The system encouraged this stupid behavior. In a hypothetical mod, I would create an actual drop system based on types of creatures and decouple fixed drops from chests in the world, then increase monster density rather dramatically. An object you obtain should have a risk and reward associated with it. Conventional isometric action RPGs are very low on challenge and are effectively gambling simulators. The dopamine hit that low IQ gamers quote-unquote feel from them is simply seeing numbers get bigger, not working for them in any meaningful manner. There are allegedly hunks of flesh out there who pay money to roll on gacha boxes, not to acquire anything specific, but to simply experience what Westerners call the ceremony of box opening. No wonder games are in such a pitiable state as they have been for the last 25 years. Naraka brought me to these considerations because it blends some aspect of all these systems together. It's a looting/gambling simulator because you spend no small portion of the main game popping loot piles. You fight other players for their loot, and so on. It's the main attraction of the Battle Royale. Unlike Diablo and World of Warcraft, the corpse popping is the objective of the game, not some rare and unintended side effect of the game's systems. But since games are fast, the investment into any given match is generally quite low, as is the chance of you optimizing a build, or even having the build you really want. Most matches you won't see any specific gold jade, for example, or certain weapons of a gold quality. Since piles don't respawn except for very rare and specific cases, you'll be pressured into using PvP to acquire your loot the more the game progresses. Throw in random spawns, the variability of PvP, and a generally simple scaling system where low gear can defeat high gear, thanks to skill due to fighting game mechanics, and Naraka's item system treads the line between interesting and forgettable. I would say it manages to toe the line in a manageable manner that I haven't seen conventional games to date manage to do. Leveling systems are generally a time gate to access high-level items, and furthermore a soft time gate to linear progression. It's a numerical way of saying you must be this tall, ergo spend this much time to enter. Dark Souls hasn't changed its experience system since it was first developed, and it's probably the worst of the offenders for this other than Diablo itself. Guild Wars has a level cap of 20, and until you reach this point, it's exactly the same way. And after you reach it, subsequent levels only give you skill points to learn skills with, which generally you will always have a huge excess of. After that, capturing elite skills is really your main form of progression, although most are very easily obtained, so it's a null issue. The worst thing you can do with leveling is lock functionality and controls behind it. Core abilities, functions, features, or access to class attributes being locked behind levels means that until you pay an arbitrary time tax, the experience will be suboptimal, if not outright unbearable. It makes leveling feel like a chore, which ultimately it is in virtually every product I've seen it in. I propose that the ideal leveling system is something that allows you to adjust specific stats in very small and controlled amounts. If you have 10 base health, you might be able to increase your health by 1 per level every major tier or so say every couple hours, for example, or increase your base damage by +1, so on. By keeping numbers small, each level will be extremely significant, and yet such numbers won't risk ballooning out of control as to either marginalize content or mandate grinding. Levels should be seen as a byproduct of good play and not a mandated procedure. They should always be in the back of your mind, but not your goal. Thus, I would continue to view both leveling up and item systems as two separate islands, to be considered largely independent, with the exception of how they both come to influence number growth. Similarly, item upgrades should be very small, contained, and distinct. Different kinds of clothing or armor should benefit something other than damage reduction or health. Armor may function like that in Naraka or 007, where it offers a small separate health pool, at least for heavier armor. Otherwise, it may influence things like the stance system currently employed by ApexX's combat system, prana regeneration, or other feature than just defensive stats alone. After all, if you increase a weapon's damage by +1, the amount of actual damage it's going to contribute over full combos is actually going to be quite significant, especially in a system as tightly balanced as that ApexX currently uses. It may even entail that I have to reimagine how numbers are currently allocated to make the growth reasonable over long game periods. Nothing discussed thus far is a new consideration. It's something I've been thinking about ever since I started playing Naraka, and reflecting more deeply upon what that experience has brought me over the last year, and why. But it's still something I do not feel very strongly about. I don't know if this line of thought is particularly valuable to me or not, but it is something that has redirected some of my thought, and a change of pace isn't necessarily a bad thing. But what would come of it, if anything? It's hard to say at this point. What I can say is I think I would like to try to create the inventory system I had started on early in the year before giving up. Perhaps that should be my highest priority, building the ability to pick up and switch between weapons, and the ability for armor and other such things to have some kind of an effect. Visuals and things like that, well, if I can't get one player character asset to function, how am I going to get something like that to work? I don't know. But that would be a contemplation for another time. Ultimately, the kind of project we're talking about is something that won't even begin to resemble what ApexX is currently like, even if I use the same character, the same environments, and the same creatures. The fact I'm talking about randomizing so many integral components, on top of introducing several major game systems, perhaps it is an evolution that will bring us absolutely nowhere. Perhaps this is where and truly the project will be dead and remain for good. Or perhaps these thoughts will bring us to something completely different. Back in the day, I would have had no hesitation but to try. But today, I don't know what will happen even tomorrow. And I have to fear the coming of dawn each and every single day. So what will happen? Who knows? But for now, we contemplate and reflect, and consider that perhaps I need to look somewhere different for my challenges.